All right.
We're live.
So welcome everyone to the launch of Gender Without Identity by Avgi, Saketopoulou, and Pellegrini. It's kind of like a redo of Sexuality Beyond Consent when we also had a very packed room. So thank you, Avgi, for bringing all the people. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. We are helped tonight by our volunteers, Tannen Reckling, Bree Panzika, and Kyle Katz. The Bureau is an all-volunteer organization, so we do have a suggested donation of $10, but we always say give what you can, if you can. And if you're planning on buying books and you'd rather spend your money that way, that is a perfectly legitimate way to support us as well. So I'm going to pass the bag around. There's some change in here. You can also donate on Venmo at BGSQD for those of you online, or if you don't have cash. So I'll pass that around. Please just keep it moving, and hopefully eventually it should make its way back to our volunteers back there. So thank you. What else did I want to say? Our regular store hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we often stay open late when we have events such as this. So please check out our events calendar on our website, which is bgsqv.com. You can also sign up for the newsletter we send out every other Monday at the back of the room or on our website. And before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to read a quick land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Mansu Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. So I'm going to introduce Griffin Hansberry. He is a psychoanalyst in New York City under the pen name Jeremiah Moss. He is the author of Feral City and Vanishing New York. His writing on the city has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Paris Review, and the New York Review of Books, and he's been a lovely, longtime friend of the Bureau. Please welcome Griffin. Oh, right.
Hello. Thank you. It's great to be here with my brilliant and beloved friends to celebrate their incendiary book, and it is, I think, incendiary. I'm going to read you their bios. Avgi Saketopoulou is a Cypriot and Greek immigrant and a psychoanalyst based in New York City. She's on faculty of the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and works extensively with trans children and their families. She's also the author of Sexuality Beyond Consent, Risk, Race, Traumatophilia, which was published earlier this year by New York University Press. Anne Pellegrini is professor of performance studies and social and cultural analysis at New York University and a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. Their books include You Can Tell Just by Looking and 20 Other Myths About LGBT Life and People, co-authored with Michael Bronsky and Michael Amico by Beacon Press. Pellegrini is the founding co-editor of the Sexual Cultures series at New York University Press. Saketopoulou and Pellegrini are the recipients of the first Tiresias Paper Award from the Sexual and Gender Diversity Studies Committee of the International Psychoanalytical Association. We'll hear more about that tonight. So just the way to orient you around the night, I'm gonna just give a short, some thoughts that I have about the book and what it brought up in me. And then Anne and Avgi are gonna speak for 5 minutes, about 5 minutes apiece. And then the three of us will be in conversation until about 8 o'clock, and after that we'll open the discussion. So when I first read the paper that makes up the core of this book, I felt both excited and frightened. After more readings and conversations with these two, I still feel excited and frightened. In my decades living as trans and then as a psychoanalyst, I've stayed away from the difficult question of why am I and my patients trans or queer. When I began analytic training and I was looking for an analyst to treat me, they were all but one fixated on this question of etiology. One analyst in our first and only session told me that I must be trans because my father couldn't tolerate having a girl. He somehow knew this after about 20 to 30 minutes talking. Another spent the session arguing with me about the absolute right of the analyst to ask why of everything, and trans could not be an exception. To be curious about my own and my patients' trans origins has always felt like an act of transphobia, an act with the implicit or explicit aim of straightening us out back to some original cis-hetero state. And now here you both are, my trusted friends and colleagues, daring to be open and curious about how we become trans and queer. And this scares me. It feels dangerous, especially now in this time of increasing anti-trans repression. But as I said, it also excites me because the way that you are curious, the theorizing you do in this book offers a queer path for the curiosity that I've harbored and kept locked in the back of my mind like a criminal thought. Part of me wants to say that you offer a safe path, but there's nothing safe about it. This path means moving through internalized transphobia, through grief, the fear of identity loss, feelings of brokenness, the wish to be repaired back to normal, and ultimately through mourning. There's no safety here. So with that in mind, lead us down the path.
Griffin. It is such a pleasure to get to be here this evening. Thank you all for coming out and to be in conversation with Griffin. It's really a dream come true. We read an early draft of the book and was so instrumental in helping us face our own fear about writing what we wrote. We didn't set out to write a book. We were forced to do so by repression, or to be more precise, we were driven to complete this volume out of sheer determination to do something about the repression we were met with during the summer of 2022. We mentioned this from the top for 2 reasons. First, because it's important to articulate that while, yes, psychoanalysis is improving, repressive forces are alive and well in our field, not covert, not subtle, not indirect, but unambiguous, unambivalent, categorical. Second, the process of this volume coming into being mirrors some of the very processes we theorize in its pages, namely that it is in the nature of the human being to treat experiences that are difficult, painful, even traumatizing. Out of that treatment can arise self-theorizations, in this case, psychoanalytic theorizations, that are not efforts to cope with or to survive trauma, but that, to the contrary, take up the energies roused by trauma, by fright even, to invent something new. In saying this, we're taking an unusual approach to trauma, asserting that trauma produces more than misery, even as misery is neither to be denied nor diminished. In that key, in chapter 1, we offer an in-depth discussion of the treatment of an atypically gendered 12-year-old child to suggest a rather forbidden and dangerous link, that trauma may have a share in the constitution of queer and trans life. We will shortly explain why we dare this risky theorizing, why we feel it is urgent and necessary, and why such a link is neither transphobic, nor does it have to tip into conversion practices, all points fleshed out in depth in the first chapter of our book. Our book is committed to a form of theorizing that helps psychoanalysts build a tolerance for how trauma can get spun into the subject, and to show how such spinning may have a share in the formation of non-normative genders and sexualities. As a psychic process, this Spending is not about consciously produced self-understandings or meaning-making that proceeds from a centered self, like a drop-down menu. It is rather a more decentered process, having to do with how trauma forces the psyche to respond, which means that the psyche has to innovate and to invent. This invention is what we refer to as self-theorization. But we want to emphasize two things. First, such theorizations do not issue from a pre-existing self. Rather, self-theorization is critical to the constitution of subjectivity. Second, self-theorization is not the work of a volitional subject who consciously narrativizes the self. Self-theorizing, as we use it, arises as a response to being breached by the other, by otherness. If the connection we're making, that trauma may well be swirled into how one comes to be queer, sexually or gender-wise, if this connection is taken by some to equate to saying that queer life is somehow broken or in need of repair, this misinterpretation comes in part from restricted ways in which trauma is thought within psychoanalysis, including restrictions on which subjects and whose traumas psychoanalysis has traditionally been able or willing to think capaciously about. Generally speaking, such critical reflection has not been equitably extended to non-normative subjects, a point we'll return to throughout this book. But first, here's the repressive backdrop against which this book was conceived. In June 2021, our paper, A Feminine Boy, Normative Investments and Reparative Fantasy at the Intersections of Gender, Race, and Religion, received the first Tiresias Paper Award from the International Psychoanalytical Association's newly composed Sexual and Gender Diversity Studies Committee. We were more than personally delighted. We were aware of how much labor had been required for the setting up of this committee within the auspices of the IPA in the first place. And in fact, many analysts felt that the Tiresias Prize was, politically speaking, a meaningful award. Interested in placing the winning papers in a reputable journal, the committee had discussed with the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, the IJP, the oldest journal in the field, established by Freud himself, that established with this journal a pact for the submission and possible publication of each year's Tiresias Award paper. Accordingly, we submitted our essay to the IJP, where it was formally accepted twice and in writing. We were offered the option of revising, and we took it, working closely with the journal's editors-in-chief. There was an editorial transition that occurred in the process of revising. We went through 2 rounds of hefty reworkings of the ideas discussed, to the great benefit of our essay. Everyone was pleased. Things were proceeding smoothly. And there was everyone's understanding that we were moving toward publication. All that was pending was for us to add acknowledgements and some material responding to the latest feedback. So in July 2022, we sent in what we thought was our final draft. Our acknowledgements included an explicit note welcoming queer and trans subjects into psychoanalysis as patients, but also as colleagues, teachers, and analysts, and we added new paragraphs addressing issues sparked by the last round of feedback into the main text. And then everything changed. The journal's communications with us took a sharp turn in content and tone. We were kindly asked to selectively remove the lines deemed too political in our acknowledgements, as well as the final additions to the main text. And the handout we gave you shows you what we were asked to remove from the footnotes, from the acknowledgements. We asked why. We got no response. We protested. We were informed that publication was no longer a given, but was now newly contingent on our compliance. We objected to this retraction of the journal's previous publication offers. Naming the repressive force did not go well. We and the committee that had given us this award received emails with legal sounding language, including words like slander and calumny. We understood there were concerns about a possible lawsuit on account of our protest. We obtained legal advice. While we were genuinely confused by this quickly rising intensity, we were also certain we would not edit the acknowledgements or remove what were important sections of our essay. The journal suggested that perhaps there shouldn't have been any revisions. And when we pointed out that 2 rounds of in-depth feedback had been offered by the journal itself, we were treated as if we were being unreasonable. It was clear we had reached an impasse. Dejected, we informed the IJP we would take our paper elsewhere. And then things got stranger still. A new email from the IJP in which we were copied informed the committee that if our paper appeared in another journal, the committee would be, quote, breaching its commitments to the IJP. Fears of lawsuits arose again. The fourth choice now appeared to be either the IJP would publish their preferred version of the paper, or there would be no publication of the first Teresias Award paper at all. We were astonished that in addition to withdrawing its previous publication commitments, the journal now seemed to be seeking to suppress our work overall. For weeks, we hovered between horror and disbelief. We sought legal advice again. Emails aimed at resolving the issue flew back and forth, and many meetings and conversations ensued. Friends and colleagues to whom we entrusted the situation, including journal editors of other psychoanalytic publications, found what was transpiring bizarre and unprecedented. We continued to refuse to straighten out our paper. The IJP definitively refused to publish it. But in true Foucauldian manner, where there's power, there's resistance, which is another way of saying that not all is repressive in the world of psychoanalysis. After the IJP debacle, we asked ourselves if we could dream anything for this paper, what would it be? We approached Jonathan House, editor of the Unconscious in Translation Press, to see if he would be interested in publishing it as part of a small volume in a series. He agreed and encouraged us to think freely, explicitly welcoming theorizing that he might even disagree with. Who knew? He also generously offered us incisive advice and made enriching suggestions that restored our faith that the work could be published. Hence, this book.
Thanks for spending your evening with us. We wrote Gender Without Identity to intervene in current debates over transness and queerness within psychoanalysis, but also in the larger culture. On the one hand, we have the born this way argument, namely that some people are born trans or born queer, just like others are born cis or born straight. Of course, no psychoanalyst explicitly espouses a born this way position, but it is the underlying presumption among gender-affirming clinicians. On the other hand, we encounter what Anne and I have come to describe as the warped this way position, namely the idea that trans and queer individuals have deviated from the correct path of straightness and cisness because of trauma, because of their own kind of social influence, because of bad parenting, etc. The born this way argument is offered as a way to counter the violence of the warped this way position. In other words, it intends to protect queer and trans life from pathologization and therapies that aim to, I'm just going to put this here because I have a lot of scare quotes, aiming to fix gendered and sexual deviations. The onslaught of the anti-LGBTQ legislation sweeping the country and the powerful homotransphobic trends within psychotherapeutic fields can make it feel now more than ever that the only viable position for clinicians who do not see queer and trans patients as pathological is to double down on the born this way rhetoric, to insist that trans and queer experience reflects some core and immutable part of the self, that it is a true, innate, and authentic expression of one's innermost being. This is especially true with trans kids, whose very existence is challenged by today's anti-trans clinical activism. This is a term that I would like us to adopt, the notion of an anti-trans clinical activism. And the sweeping legislative and policy measures that are now going on across the country. A commonly cited proof is the idea that childhood transness is a symptom of trauma. If children, this logic goes, mistakenly think they're trans, it's because trauma has warped their connection with their true gender, as marked by their genitals and assigned at birth, a gender which of course is understood as always already cis and binary. What such young people need, these clinicians argue, is not transition care, but therapeutic attention to treat the trauma and which will address their vulnerability to social contagion in order to correct their gender. These views license lawmakers to pass bills that deny life possibilities to trans youth and do so in the name of protecting trans kids from themselves. Hence the audacious euphemism of, for example, Montana's recent anti-trans law named the Youth Health Protection Act. We belong to a growing minority of psychoanalysts who have extensive experience with trans and queer patients and who vociferously oppose the suppression of trans life. And we are ourselves members of the queer community. But we are not so quick to deny that trauma may have a share in how individuals experience their gender. In fact, our own work with trans children and adults leads us to surprising and even counterintuitive observation that sometimes transness, far from being a symptom of trauma, can emerge from trauma. And this is not specific to transness either. All gender is to some degree shaped by trauma, normative and non-normative. Gender is the outcome of how trauma forces the psyche to respond, which means, as Anne was talking about earlier, that the psyche has to innovate and to invent. If trauma becomes the epicenter of corrective attention only when it comes to gender expansiveness, however, this is only because atypical genders are seen as a priori less than, unwanted, unwelcome, and strange. So we wrote this book because we are tired. We are tired of the blackmail that born this way arguments are based on. The threat that any other accounting of queer and trans existence endangers us and endangers the people we care about, our patients, our colleagues, our friends. There's a dire need for analytic ideas that do not capitulate to the notion that the only way to counter the pathologizing of sexual and gender complexity is by imagining them to be innate. Nor is it humane to regard variant genders and sexualities without the resource of psychic complexity that is so routinely afforded to normative subjects. So we urge colleagues to let go of arguing innateness as the LGBTQ party line. Not only have born this way arguments failed to insulate queer people from violence and discrimination, not only are such arguments ethically short-sighted, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how anyone became queer or trans, because there's nothing wrong with being queer or trans. From a psychoanalytic perspective, they're also oversimplified and clinically naive. Even more importantly, acquiescing to the born this way rhetoric impoverishes us. It impoverishes our conversations about the complexity of queer and trans life. It impoverishes us clinically. It impoverishes our capacity to appreciate the strange agency that comes with becoming trans, becoming queer, becoming non-binary. We describe in the book this agency as strange because it is not a willful agency. It does not issue from a centered self. It is autonomous in a psychoanalytic way. It is always already allocentric. It issues from the effects of the other's intrusion into us. Rather than running the hamster wheel time and again to confront homotransphobia, gender without identity recalibrates our attention to build the theory and thinking we need to be able to work towards the flourishing of our queer and trans patients in the consulting room, and to be able to help patients be more in their gender, in their queerness, less plagued by concerns that it might be inauthentic or false or a deviation. And we want to do that not because we believe that variant genders or sexualities are true. We don't actually believe that any gender or sexuality is actually true, but because all genders are mythological constructions, albeit with material consequences. Our starting point then is that there's nothing wrong with being trans or queer, that there's no wrong way to be trans or queer, and most importantly, that there's no wrong way to become trans or queer. To do this work, we have had to contest the powerful traumatophobic stance that is very deeply ingrained in psychoanalysis, but also in the general culture. That if trauma has a share in the development of atypical genders and sexualities, that means that they are definitionally invalidated because it makes them inauthentic or false. Resisting the traumatophobic logic that sees anything connected to trauma as cause for suspicion or alarm, we advocate for clinicians to think traumatophilically, to view trauma not as a way of questioning the plausibility of queer and trans life, but to help articulate its textures. We are committed to a form of thinking that helps psychoanalysts build a tolerance for how trauma gets weaved into the subject, for what subjects do with their trauma. Such spinning is not about consciously produced self-understandings. It arises as a psychic response, and it is driven to being breached by the other, and is driven by the exigency of the unconscious. We dare this theorizing to show that it is possible to look in the rear-view developmental mirror, to consider paths for a typical gender's becoming, without that having to insinuate that they detoured from a normal gender course, and without capsizing into conversion therapy. But importantly, we're also not moving to prescribe how any one individual gay, queer, or trans subject understands their origins. Nor are we saying that anyone who experienced themselves as having been born this way is wrong. The way that we see psychoanalytic ethics is that every individual, especially individuals from oppressed minorities, get to use the names and generate the self-understandings that resonate for them, not for the analyst, not for the culture, not for the legislators. What we want to do is make room for more ways for psychoanalysts, for clinicians, and for our culture to understand that gender and sexuality can have a background and a history without that meaning that they're illegitimate. Our book's ethical call then is to offer metapsychologies and clinical spaces that treat gender and sexual diversity, not by making room for them or accepting them. We don't want the philanthropy of tolerance. We want a psychoanalysis that actually wants gay people and wants trans people and wants queer people. We want and deserve professional spaces that delight and marvel in the pleasures of difference. Thank you.
So, I've heard you say you want to burn down psychoanalysis. Start there.
Burning down the
Start
house.
there. Burn down psychoanalysis. What do you want to burn down?
I want to burn down, I mean, I think it is burning down, we just need to acknowledge that it's not working. I think that the psychoanalysis that treats trauma as having only negative effects, is that needing to be drained from the psyche. Like, we need to move past that. Like, that psychoanalysis is not worth saving.
So you talked about the process of writing a book and how it started as a paper to combat transphobia and psychoanalysis, and then that problem turned right against it. How has that affected you as you continue doing this work? Where is that reverberating inside you at this point in time? That sort of betrayal. Did you experience it as a betrayal?
Yeah, I mean, it was a betrayal, but it was also so bewildering because, both Avgi and I published a lot, and, the paper seemed to be on a smooth course. We were utterly unprepared for also this throwdowner on acknowledgements. I've been editing other people's work for actually decades now. I've never touched anyone's acknowledgements other than to say, oh my God, this is so cool, so and so, right? Acknowledgements are like the gossip girl of academia. So it was really shocking. And I think that it was also, I would say, and this is an overused term, but I mean this, it was traumatic. But we did something with that trauma. But I think the experience was really also very difficult. Avgi was just finishing her first book. I've been dealing with an ongoing elder care sort of emergency. And so I was very absorbed by that. So we were also, each of us, dealing with other things that were preoccupying us. And so this was, I don't think we quite experienced what we're experiencing while we're experiencing it. But luckily, psychoanalysis has language for that.
I mean, to some degree, it was also the disbelief of, wow, like we received this award from a committee that was put together to fight institutional homotransphobia. And then here's the first paper, and it can't get published. And not only can it not get published, I mean, it's both funny, like now it's kind of like, look, it's both amusing and infuriating, and it's a kind of repetition that is entirely like predictable, but also like it breaks your heart every time. And to come into this work, you have to be willing to let your heart be broken every time. It takes tremendous vulnerability.
And I've also heard you say that it really sort of galvanized your sense of the necessity of this work, right? Do you want to say something about that? You've been speaking on it, but the necessity, like what drives you to? Because you're putting this out into a book, which really taking the risk and pushing against that repression in a very strong way. Yeah. What's the thing that's really driving it?
We actually, I'd say we actually both love psychoanalysis. And it hasn't always deserved that. And so in some sense, we actually think psychoanalysis needs to die unless it can mutate. And part of that mutation means coming into contact with this book is in conversation with queer and trans studies, in particular trans and color critique, and queer and trans theories of negativity. Psychoanalysis needs to not just take in these theories and suddenly like, oh, we got that, let's apply it. It needs to let itself be undone by that contact. So that's how much we love psychoanalysis. We want to actually slay it.
You want to traumatize psychoanalysis?
Yes. We want to, we're tenderizing it, right? Tenderly. So this, I mean, I think that there are other ways in which we saw the necessity of this book. Part of what Avgi alluded to, what has felt to be the blackmail that we've been felt so limited politically in the kinds of arguments we could offer to defend queer and trans life. And the way that has played out in psychoanalysis has been very unpsychoanalytic, like queer and trans affirmative, but unpsychoanalytic. And we actually, this is where I'm greedy. I think I should get to have my cake and eat it too. So does Avgi, right? Like we can be queer and trans affirmative and be psychoanalytic, but it would be a different psychoanalysis and it'd be a different version of affirming queerness and transness.
I mean, what I would add to that is, excuse me, at some point we realized that we actually have to make the theory we need. It's not out there. And rather than it's not out there and how come it's not done and how come it's this and that, like eventually we had to make it. And the risk of this book is that like we've been concerned about backlash from both sides, both from the conservative aspect of psychoanalytic thinking, because what we're doing, we don't just love psychoanalysis, we also love queerness. We have a deep commitment to queerness. And we believe that queerness can bring something to psychoanalysis, but for that, psychoanalysis needs to be turned inside out. And we want to be able to do that. At the same time, we are going at what we know is the most revered and most under threat idea right now in psychoanalysis, which is that queerness can only be protected by kind of like treating it as a sacred object. And that does not help our patients. I mean, that's part of where we found ourselves feeling the need for better theory, deeper theory.
And you use a deeply interdisciplinary approach. It's kind of a hybrid book. Did you feel that was really important in order to do this weaving that you did?
Yes, absolutely. We couldn't do this book and just stay within psychoanalysis, because even to develop the kind of psychoanalytic theory we wanted, it has to be estranged from itself and really be sort of, and again, take it over, give itself over to ways of thinking from other fields and other domains. And for us, that meant queer and trans theories, also Jewish cultural studies, which is sort of one of my fields. But it really, it's interdisciplinary. And it's also hybrid in its writing because there's also a short essay by Marco Posadas. Marco was the inaugural chair of the Sexual and Gender Diversity Committee, which gave this award, helped to devise the Teresias paper, and had written an introduction laying out the history of that prize, as well as the kind of obstacles within psychoanalysis to creating the committee and the prize. And that was to accompany the essay when it was published in IJP. And he'd already written it. And it felt very important to us that that essay, in which he had expended so much thinking and the political work he'd done, we wanted it to have a home too. So the volume also includes Marco's essay. And then it has a chapter, a very famous chapter by Jean Laplanche, who's sort of one of the theoretical anchors for this volume. That was at Jonathan House's suggestion. So we're lucky to get to reprint that English language translation by Laplanche.
I mean, very often interdisciplinary work, like the metaphor that we use in the book, is that it's kind of like very much like the minotaur that is kind of like consuming these tributes to stay alive. Psychoanalysis is staying alive, but kind of like basically cannibalizing these different kinds of discourses rather than becoming changed by them. So there is this sense of like, oh, we're intersectional, oh, we're thinking about race, oh, we're thinking about difference. But there are so many ways in which psychoanalysis can, not all psychoanalysis, but a big chunk of it basically appropriates these ideas and like defends them. And we have wanted a psychoanalysis that is responsible and response-able to these kinds of interventions.
So getting into the unsettling stuff, right? So you on the one hand, you're saying it doesn't matter how we become trans, how we become queer, and yet you've written this book, this paper about why it matters, how we become trans and queer. How do you square that, those two parts?
I'll say something first. So it absolutely does not matter how anyone becomes queer or trans from a legal or policy perspective. Because there's nothing wrong with being queer or trans. Everyone should have equal rights. From a legal political perspective, it doesn't matter. But
From a pathologizing perspective,
and certainly, and it doesn't. We absolutely refuse any idea that there's something pathological in being or becoming queer or trans. And yet, for individuals, it well matters to us, right? How we understand ourselves. This is when we use the language of mythology, right? How we mythologize ourselves. And we mythologize ourselves also in relationship to dominant culture and to also subcultural formations, right? To the material that's available to us that we can pull on as we're narrativizing ourselves. For people who belong to historically minoritized populations, we're forced over and over again to give an account of ourselves. We're told that our identities matter because they're the wrong identities. So how we understand ourselves to have become queer or trans do matter in that regard, right? They shouldn't matter legally and politically, but they're made to matter in ways they shouldn't. So to the extent that they're made to matter when they legally should not, we need a better account that can actually listen for the complexity, reckon with the complexity, but also to the extent that queer and trans people are curious about ourselves. Like other people, like I've heard that other people get to be curious about themselves. Right? So that without it being cause for the loss of, equality and freedom.
I mean, I would really emphasize this last point that there is like almost a ban, a prohibition on like going to certain places with patients. And I want to make sure that I clarify here. I am not talking about, read this book and then go into the consulting room and start like trying to hunt for where your patient's gender comes from. This is not our intervention. Our intervention is about having the tools and the conceptual armamentarium so that when patients begin to either go in that direction or you begin to sense that it's there, but it frightens them, you have room to be able to think in a way that does not capsize you into conversion treatment or into some kind of transphobic stance.
You think too that I hear you saying, right? Don't read this book and go hunting. But I wonder, could we say, let's read this book and then have an internal shift that then opens up a space into which the patient might also become curious about these questions, right?
Yeah. I mean, the trick here, you were talking about being afraid. I'm also very afraid of this book. I am there were so many moments when we were writing this and we'd stop and look at each other and say, should we be publishing this? Especially now, is this only dangerous? I mean, it's definitely dangerous. But we've also, I'll speak for myself, I've sat with so many patients where the conversation can only go so far and there's so much anxiety about fantasies and thoughts that patients are already having, right? And to be told, well, you can't explore that because to explore that it's transphobic or homophobic when the patient is already preoccupied with it is to impose, it is to be so invested in one's own goodness that we're actually hampering the patient. But then the question is, if you're not going to do that, what are you going to do? And that's part of what we wanted to offer, one possible set of roadmaps, not the final one, not the one, for how one might think this way too. We wanted to show that it's possible to do this work without being transphobic, without trying to change somebody's gender.
And as I understand it, that roadmap, part of that roadmap is through a traumatophilic, right? So tell us about, these are big words, traumatophilic, traumatophobic, right? Just spend some time with that. What are they about? How does gender operate around them as you think of it?
So traumatophilia comes from, it's a word that comes from Jean Laplanche, and which I have really taken up and blown up into a full conceptual framework. And now we're using it to think about gender. In my previous book, I was thinking about sexuality and race through it. It is, the major point that we're making is that we are, as a culture and as a discipline, very traumatophobic, meaning that we engage trauma in patients or in our theory as something that needs to be eliminated, as something that needs to be repaired, as something that needs to be healed. Of course, nobody ever gets healed from trauma. It just does not happen. we get taught that. We talk about reparation, we talk about kind of like integration, we talk about all of these kinds of things, but repair is an impossibility. At best, what you get is transformation. Like, now, transformation has a very distinctive difference from than a more traumatophobic approach to trauma, which is that rather than the effort to take trauma and heal it and make it disappear, traumatophilia is more about the ways in which we're drawn to our traumata and the ways in which people do things with their trauma. And one of the ways that we've been thinking in this book about gender is that gender may be a way of doing something with certain kinds of traumata. If you're thinking traumatophobically, then that becomes a problem. If you're thinking traumatophilically, there's all kinds of, I mean, when you're training as an analyst, one of the things that you get very analyzed about in your own analysis is why you want to become an analyst. But that is not done in the interest of, and maybe you shouldn't, if it comes from the fact that your mother was invasive or you had these damaged internal objects, maybe you shouldn't be doing that, right? We don't do that, but we do that around gender, right? And this is where traumatophobia is also specific to certain kinds of categories of which we are pretty panicked.
Well, we do that around some genders. I mean, one of the things that also we encountered in the course of writing the book is there's long been the story that basically we ask why of so-called deviant sexualities and genders. Why is this person queer? Why is this person gay? Why is this person trans? But we don't ask why with respect to normative genders and normative sexualities. And then as we were sort of going back to the literature, we realized, well, actually we talk about the vicissitudes of normative genders and sexualities all the time. It fills the case history of psychoanalysis, whether it's Little Hans, whom Freud made famous, or Joan Ribiere's Masquerading Woman. The vicissitudes of just how hard it is to be a normative woman, or how difficult it is to be a little boy who's meant to grow into being a man. It's actually hard work. And psychoanalysis has thought about this, sometimes well, sometimes less so, but it's never done so thinking, oh, this masquerading woman is really not a woman, right? Or we little Hans would be better off as, little Hannah or something, right? But when it comes to a trans person or a queer person, any difficulty, suddenly the vicissitudes mean, oh, got it wrong, right? So we want also to give to queer and trans subjects the same dignity of misery, right? We already have marriage, why not get to the same dignity of misery and the vicissitudes and transformations that are just granted. The grace of normativity. Like we want in on that too.
Speaking of misery,
Good segue.
Trans negativity, right, influenced your work or maybe enabled it. Can you speak a little bit about what that is and how it comes into play?
Trans negativity is a movement in trans studies which has been incredibly influential for us, and which is, to say this like relatively briefly, is interested in how to think about the negative as a potentiating possibility in trans experience, as opposed to that has to be eliminated. So usually the notion of negative affect, as in dysphoria, is what needs to be cured. And the whole thing of how right now, how insurance companies are organized, how the petition to the state for hormones, the petition to doctors for surgeries is organized around the notion of draining negative affect. And of course, then creates the expectation, and we hear this all the time, that if the idea is that kind of like the job is for trans people to be happy, if you've had a surgery and you're not happy, then maybe it's not about your transness, right? So like in some ways, trans subjects have are expected, and non-normative subjects in general, but especially trans subjects, are expected to have like a more simple, a more basic kind of psychic life that responds, kind of everything converges down to a surgery or hormones or a letter.
It's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you don't find the happiness trough, then you're wrong, right? I mean, I think that, that we don't draw directly on Sarah Ahmed's, notion of the feminist killjoy. I think that's in there as well. Like down with happiness, in the sense that the imperative to be happy and to be happy in normative ways. And that imperative to be happy in normative ways is an imperative that now non-normative subjects are asked to enjoy as well. Enjoy with scary quotes.
It makes me think of the risk in putting trans negativity out there too, right? And like we have Andrea Long Chu's essay about not her new vagina didn't make her happy, and how so many trans people really came out against her for that, with this fear that it's going to be weaponized, right, by transphobes. And so, just sort of like to fold into that, talk more about your own fears of this book and how, your fears of it being weaponized. And,
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, like when that essay came out, where she said, my vagina won't make me happy, but I should be able to get it anyway, right? That was what that essay was about. Like, I think, this is often discussed as a very difficult moment in the trans community. I also think it was such a delightful moment because all of a sudden, trans people were not a class and a singular organism. Trans people were like singular individuals with a variety of different opinions that conflict. There was no party line. The party line was broken. And like this is to be able to move away from thinking about a class of people as having to move all together like one single being, but having their own particularities is part of what it means to be human, and to not be dehumanizing by expecting this kind of uniformity. The challenge is, in some ways, the expectation that if you're going to have a surgery, then the surgery should make you happier, otherwise why are you going to have it, is not just coming from the social world of imposition, it also is built into this idea that gender identity is something core, right? And if your core gender identity just happens to be misaligned with your body, then there's a certain set of protocols and principles that if you meet them, if you take hormones, if you kind of like date this kind of person, do that kind of thing, then you should be happy. So it's also baked into kind of like this notion that is very prominent in psychoanalysis right now, this notion of a true gendered self, which we think is experientially true, and people experience themselves as like, this is my true gender, and we don't want to take this away. But it's also an illusion. There is no true gender or accurate gender. There is the gender that works for us at the time that it does, and sometimes it shifts and sometimes it doesn't.
I'm also thinking about wanting to make room for the reality, which is that people go on hormones, they have surgeries, and maybe have results that are different than what they expected. These could be results they're really happy with, results they're less than happy with. But to be unhappy with the result or to be less than happy with the result, it's not the same thing as regretting it. We want to make space for that too. Right? And even to speak about the issue of regret is also to sort of open up the question of detransition and how to talk about that more capaciously. If we move away from a concept of a core gender identity, gender is truth and authenticity, then if someone detransitions, this doesn't mean that this sort of whatever therapeutic process happened to identify this true gender and the person transitioned and oh, this was wrong, they got it wrong, that this was a false picture, now they're back to the true one. Rather, we can see this as it were transition all the way down. Detransitioning is an ongoing transitioning. And it could take away, so we could maybe breathe a little bit less anxiously as clinicians and also in the wider culture around these debates. Certainly, the few cases of detransition are being weaponized against trans people, but that's not a reason not to talk about detransition in the ways in which trans people know. Like this is the more complicated conversations that people are having about it outside without microphones in front of them, right?
You worry that this book will be weaponized?
Yes.
And how do you deal with that anxiety and with the ethics around putting this out into the world?
I mean, I'll speak for myself, like I've lost a lot of sleep over this. And I've talked to many from hours and hours with people like we trust, whose politics we trust, and whose relationship to psychoanalysis we trust. But at the end of the day, it has come to feel that it is necessary, especially because of where things are right now, to have more complicated ways of thinking about transness and gender. And I would say one more thing. We have left trauma to the right and to trans folks. We have nothing to say about trauma. All we can, I wrote a paper in 2014 about massive gender trauma, basically the idea that like you're traumatized by virtue of how you're treated as a trans person. But we have had zero, and other people, of course, have written about this as well. Many, like thousands of papers, maybe hundreds. But we have had nothing to say about whether trauma has a share in the constitution of trans life. And that means that the only conversation out there around trauma is conversation that accrues to transphobic practices, to conversion. And we need to take this back. We really do. I think it's really urgent. So if I lose sleep, I'm also relieved with every time I hear somebody say, oh, but this is because of trauma, this is not your true gender. I'm thinking, oh, we have something to say about that. There is no such thing as a true gender. There's just the experience of gender.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is something we have both lost sleep over. And, we also feel very fortunate. We've talked to a lot of colleagues about this and talking about our fears, and they were talking about their fears, and also that we also felt shored up to do it, and it's like to dare to do it anyway. And we felt very relieved by at least the preliminary responses we're hearing from people, that because some of what we're saying just intuitively feels accurate, and not just with respect to queer or transgenders, but all gender. It's just not easy to be a person in the world, right? And gender is one of the ways in which we're called to be a person in the world, one of the forms we're supposed to take, and it's done on demand. And then the question is, how do we make something of something we weren't asked, we were never given the option not to choose, right? And that's doing something with the trauma of that forced imposition.
I just want to add really quickly, the part of what worries me is also a too enthusiastic embrace of these ideas. So what happened, right before we were told that the publication offer was retracted, we were offered a feedback that we're told, you don't have to respond to this. You can take it if you want. You don't have to. You can just send us the acknowledgements and we're done. And we looked at the feedback and we were like, oh, wow, they are not misreading what we're saying, but they're reading it in the most conservative possible way, in a way that could actually be used in negative ways. And we're like, okay, now we need to go back and actually, now we have seen where where one of the cracks are. We need to go and fill that in. And that's when we encountered this tremendous resistance, when we clarified that, yeah, we're not using it for that. This is for something else. So that's another danger. But thinking is dangerous. No, really thinking beyond cliches, thinking beyond platitudes, thinking beyond slogans. It's dangerous, and it's singular for every single case. And I think we need to dare it.
I thought twice about putting a blurb of mine on the back of your list. I was like, oh, that's scary, putting my name on this. But I absolutely, meant every word that I said. I think it's a really important book. It opens up so much. And it does, I feel so much permission from it in my relationship to myself and queer and trans patients. So thank you for that. I want to, we're just out of time. So my last question, you mentioned you have been getting some responses from readers. What are people saying about this book so far?
I mean, I really do think mostly we're hearing relief. And I think that it's certainly the case that for many queer and trans people, the always already, the born that way narrative never resonated, right? So it's already the case that other self-narratives have circulated, but they're not the ones that have been put forward in our political campaigns. So I think to create more space for the complexity that's already out there, as I think that's been a relief. But also, I get it. I think there's just been this intuitive hit about the relationship between, sort of the think gender as a trauma, and also gender is doing so much other work than just gender as well. I mean, gender holds so much, it absorbs so much, it's so overburdened that it's doing the work often of racialization, it's doing the work of class marking, of religious difference. Mm-hmm. And to and that's not the same thing as intersectionality. It's actually to really think of psychic and materialist complexity. So, and also, so with intersectionality, but with, all this other stuff around it, it's so important. So I think that we're happy with that feedback. And we're both excited and, a little neurotically excited, so we can be anxious and excited at the same time as the book continues to circulate out there.
I would add, this is a really new step. It's in a really new direction. I think that if it opens up, which we hope it's something up in the conversation, which we hope it will, I think that 10 years from now, it will look very simplistic, what we're saying. Right? I think, every first step, it may feel very bold in the moment, but there's going to be a lot of work to do around it. And our hope is that other people will take this and do things with it and change it and critique it and really put it to the test. So this is we're not giving it as a fetish or as a substitution of don't use that, use this. Like, this is really about breaking something up, and then eventually it will be broken up itself, and that's really great when that moment happens.
Thank you. So, thank you so much.
We talked about fear enough.
Do you want to talk more about fear?
I'm wondering, I don't know, I mean, we
About-
can talk about it to the audience.
Sure, yeah. Does this book make people afraid? Let me put a question to the audience. Yeah? You wanna-
Yes. Hi. Thank you. This is so validating. I grew up in a gender apartheid in Iran under Islamic regime as a first Muslim, and as a first woman. After I immigrated, I rethought my gender, and I was like, from now on, I'm non-binary because I don't want to give any state another opportunity to weaponize my gender against me. And I have been talking to my therapist, and we don't have any language. Of course, she's white, American, and Jewish. The only language that we have is Handmaid's Tale, the TV show, and that's our only common ground. And even that invalidates my choice of queerness, my choice of non-binary, my choice of pansexuality, because I'm like, fuck that state. I want to be whatever I want, and I don't care if it's not the right way. I wasn't born queer. That's the one of my challenges in therapy, because in Iran, we didn't have the language, we didn't have any resources of that. I didn't choose to be queer in Iran because I didn't know what it is. And in the US, I want that agency of my choice of gender be validated, and your book is doing that. And I know that you're afraid. I just wanted to say this because I know you're afraid how it's weaponized, but it's actually de-weaponizing the Islamic regime based on what you're saying, that, okay, if it's all social construct, then I'm not a woman anymore. If you want to put a scarf on my head, I'm not a woman. It's still an issue. It's the woman issue is still an issue. But my choice to become queer or recognize my queerness, or develop my queerness, was because of my trauma. And I really, really appreciate that you put this out there, even though you're afraid that it's going to be weaponized. I'm just telling that it's going to also be de-weaponizing many oppressive forces. Thank you.
This is the right moment to say this. I don't want to get too technical, but part of what we're working with in the book is Laplanche's theory, which like when you say like I choose it, like you know, part of what Laplanche talks about when he talks about this kind of like strange kind of agency, what in the book we call queer agency. He talks about how the materials with which we make these decisions are not of our own making, neither are they of our control. So this idea that, oh, like kids are going online and they're exposed to things that are not theirs, they're being contaminated by something else. We're contaminated all the time. It's just that we recognize some things as contaminations and see others, like the state is not a contaminant until you realize that it is. And then once you see that, you can't unsee it, right? So there's this way in which kind of like social categories, like myths, symbols, what Laplanche calls the mythosymbolic, are actually quite critical, and critical ingredients, critical materials through which our gender experience comes to feel to us what it is. And it's about time to start thinking, if you're not thinking my gender is something core to me, something true that's just about gender, but you see gender as always being alloyed by these materials, then there's more chance to not be invalidating experiences that have already been like weaved through those codes.
Yeah, just, I think that part of what Avgi's also picking up on is you're describing coming into contact with different mythosymbolic materials in this altered cultural context, which gives you new languages for your self-mythology, right? Which is, and this again is the strange agencies. It's agentic, but it's not a sovereignty that proceeds only from you, right? It's a sovereignty that's carved out into you, but it started outside you. I mean, it's just like, so this is again, it's an agency that is never only solo,
It's not neoliberal, willful, kind of like centered.
And that, you know, that's the answer too to the right's argument about the virality of, you know, rapid onset gender dysphoria and like, right, it's catching, you can catch it through the internet. I mean, they're not wrong.
Luckily, this is not being recorded.
And so, say more about that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's very important because they're not wrong, but they're also not right. So, and here's what I mean by that. This exposure to like a wider set of mythosymbolic codes puts on offer more from which one can draw for whatever psychic mechanisms will then turn something into an experience. So they're wrong. They're not wrong that this wider variety makes more available, but they are wrong in the sense it's almost as if like it is downloaded into us, right? As if there is no psychic life that intervenes. If that, like when you say they're not wrong and people laugh, I think somewhat with anxiety and anger as well, it's not being recorded, right? If we feel anxiety about that, it's because we start with the premise that to end up with a gender that you have caught on the internet is a problem, not if you're cis. So, you know, like makeup trans, like hair trans, like you see these videos.
Catching it through Vogue magazine.
Yeah.
Yes, like, you know, if you catch cisgender, that's fine. That's not. That's just like fashion, right? So these are very different metrics, right?
And the more transgenders that are available in public, the more transgender, which is why we have to be eradicated from public.
Exactly.
And it certainly, I mean, I'm glad you bring this up, the eradication of quote transgenderism from public life. And it is about public life because, you know, all of this swirl of horrendous legislation is making it impossibly, the idea is make it impossible to be trans in public. You can't use a public bathroom, right? You can't play sports. You are, you know, you can't be taught about in school. You can't teach in school, right? So it's more and more like it's house arrest, right?
Don't
So
ask, don't tell.
you can be trans in private. And because it's also the imagination that trans people are infectious and queerness is infectious and actually, and this is actually, and we are in some way, but again, not the way they think, right? That this is also the, you know, the double bind of more representation. It actually does produce more violence because we're more visible to be worried over.
But if it's contagious in the way that we're talking about, it's also because normative sexuality and normative gender are also predicated on a lot of repression and a lot of psychic amputations. So that this kind of contact actually opens up to things that one had left outside. And then it's always easier to say this was done to me as opposed to this was awakened in me or something derived from me.
Which leads me to another one of my anxieties about your theory, right? We're supposed to be doing Q&A, but we're just going to talk. You know, I came out of as trans in the late 80s and transitioned in the early 90s. I'm like, I'm old, right? So my transgender, I know it's more rigid than a lot of younger people who are coming out now. Their transgenders have a flexibility that mine just doesn't have, and I just know that. But what you're putting forth opens up the possibility for my transgender to kind of like break apart, right? And this is scary to me, right? So like the same in the same way, but the way cisgender can fall apart in the face of trans, right? So,
I mean, to some degree, I would say that however you've gravitated to the binary, whether it's cis or trans, every binary is kind of like predicated on a certain set of repressions. So it's then vulnerable to coming into contact with otherness. So then one of the questions becomes kind of like what happens at the moment of terror as if it's going to be taken away, right? And I think that terror is different for cis subjects as opposed to trans subjects because trans subjects have had the history of having been invalidated, so they need to hold on to it with a different kind of tenacity. For different reasons, not just the defensive reasons that I was saying about repression and so on and so forth. But I also wanted to say, talking about cultural materials and kind of like the contagion and the kind of like authentic gender, like I want to say like also a lot of genders that look cis and for the most part are cis also come through different paths. So maybe I'll say a story about my gender, which is that, you know, I grew up kind of like being like very butch, being a very masculine child. And I never understood myself as trans. I didn't feel like, oh, I'm a boy. I also didn't feel, oh, I'm a girl. I just felt like, okay, I'm being read as a boy. That's good enough, whatever. And then somewhere in my late teens, I was taken in for various reasons that don't have to do with gender per se. I was taken in by a couple of trans women, like really took care of me. And in the course of kind of like having kind of adopted me, they also gave me my gender. So the gender that I have now that looks cis, and I'm not trans, right? But I'm also not cis in this cis way of like, I was female assigned at birth. I acquired my femininity and it was routed through trans women. So you tell me, is that cis? Like, I mean, it's something, it's not cis, but it's also not cis. So this idea that cisness is also a homogeneous category, or that we know how somebody gets to it. Like, these women gave me my gender, and this doesn't feel wrong, and it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like, oh, like they turned me into something else. It feels like they turned me into something, and that works. I mean, this works well enough, whatever.
You want to tell us about your gender?
How much time we got? We were talking last night. We each had this kind of really poignant, like personal turn in the conversation last night. But, you know, I do think of, you know, gender as we are assaulted by it, and it's given to us. It's a gift and it's an assault. And I know I'm a gender theorist in part because my gender has been misrecognized from before I remember, right? So cisness would be a misrecognition, transness would be a misrecognition. You know, I've been called a boy since I was a little kid. I'm a gender theorist because I was able to find that misrecognition fascinating and a thing of curiosity rather than a cause for shame, right? That's the first thing I'll say. But, you know, one of the encounters that most stands out in my memory is being in the locker room where some of the most interesting encounters to do with gender have happened. And as they often do with my short hair, my gloves on, my white leather belt, and this little boy, probably 3 years old, was with his mother and looking at me, and I knew it was going to come next because I could see the exchange between the boy and the mother. And she encouraged him. He came over and encouraged me, and he said to me, "Are you a lady or a man?" And it was asked with utter curiosity, the way that children ask, right? There was nothing of hostility in it. And what I wanted to say was, I'm a homosexual. Like, that's my gender. Right? I was feeling very old school. But I saw he's with his mother, and I just didn't know how she would take it. Like, like New York Island. So instead I said something that's also true. And the thing is, no answer is true, no answer is false. I said, neither. He laughed with delight. I think he was thinking, finally, an adult who tells the truth. And then what he said to me, laughing, like, "You're a lady and a man," turning my "or" into an "and," which is also true. Right? And I thought this was to go back to the issue of translation. But translation, I said something that was new to him, and he translated it into something actually kind of cool and inclusive. And then he asked me if I would show him the lock to my locker. Right? So I showed him my locker, you know. I hope he became a gender theorist too.
We still have time for questions. I mean, we don't need questions. It could be, you know, comments or thoughts or
Denunciations.
I have a sort of annoying question about neoliberalization in the state. I'm a clinician and I'm non-binary, and I love you talking about these out of the clinic opportunities to share gender experience, and it resonates so much. These moments of uncertain recognition that feel like way more recognition than anything else. And I guess like part of my unformed question is like, what do we see as like part of the clinic is like legitimating non-binary and trans like clinical care? Like I take Medicare and I'm so stealth on social media because I don't want anyone, like any of the neocons and the alt-right to like come after my license or to like trigger an audit. And like I get to see like trans and non-binary people through that like would never have access to clinical services. So I guess I'm wondering, like at this moment, like, are we thinking that most of this recognition comes from like children that are innocent, or like how do we also become like the trans elders that are, you know, recognizing someone and nourishing them and bringing them into a gender experience? So this question's all over the place, but it's like, is there a clinical path forward to providing like actually like trans competent and non-binary competent care, or like happy pride? Like how are we? Is this what we're doing here tonight? Like who's trans and non-binary here that's healing and that needs to be here and that is getting some part of themselves recognized and that's been starving.
Yeah, so you've said a lot that's super important. So I think there are a couple strands, and I'll pick on one, and I think Avgi will pull on another. The first has to do with demedicalization, and we're not there yet, right? Because right now, people who want access to hormones and surgeries, and they're in states where that's still possible, and I want to mark that, right? The legislative assaults are trying to make that harder and harder, right? But if you're going to get access to hormones or surgeries, and you're lucky enough to have insurance, whether it's Medicaid or private insurance, you need a letter, often two, like one from a medical doctor, another from a therapist, psychiatrist. So we are in the business of writing these letters, basically lending our license and our professional reputations to help someone get the hormones and surgeries they want. And we have to sort of craft these in ways that insurance companies will recognize. That's because of the particular healthcare system we operate in, the particular state, the way that interacts with these for-profit, insurance companies. So we would wish for a demedicalization because we should not be in a position of gatekeeping. But at the same time, the world we live in is one in which we must offer those letters, or our patients can't get that access. Those who are fortunate enough to have the insurance that would give them that access, right? Always that caveat. So we can't say, well, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to get my hands dirty, right? We have to get our hands dirty, even as we want to maybe lend our professional sort of expertise or our professional voices to demedicalization, because it shouldn't be this way, right? And I'd love to get out of that business so that we can talk with our queer and trans and non-binary patients about any number of things, which would include gender and sexuality, I'm sure, but it wouldn't be with the same threat hanging over them. Am I gonna get a letter? Do I have to tell the story the right way? Right? I think this would take so much pressure off the work we do, the way we're able to listen, the fear and anxiety on both sides.
I have a couple of things to say that also will take us in a different direction. First of all, one kind of like quick shorthand to think a little bit differently, but very, very consistent with what I was saying, but with different words, is, and we talk about this in the book a lot, that as clinicians we participate in treatments, we do not just witness. And this idea of ally, I have been very influenced by the work of Marquise Bay, who says, who is arguing towards accomplices rather than allies. So what that means in the context of an analytic treatment is a very complicated issue, but I think it's important. But I would, and one more thing, it's not just the question of demedicalization and letters, it's also that the landscape is changing. There's going to be lawsuits now. Those are coming. If you're writing letters, if you are participating in this kind of, those are coming. And
that part of your anxiety in the book, like people coming after your professional licenses.
Not so much our licenses, about what they're going to do with these ideas and how they're going to use them in the most virulent and transphobic way. But I would say also something else, and this is kind of a much more, it's not a how-to, and I don't have something to suggest, but I would say the following. You are in some ways stealth, right, as a way of protecting your license and protecting yourself from being from practicing. Being stealth is also part of the effective commons of transness in some way throughout the centuries. So in that regard, you are with your patient in a way that is actually very much about transness, right? So I personally have a very strong critique of the notion of affirmation, not because we think we should be antagonizing our patients or like being the arbiters of what somebody else's gender is, because I think that the notion of affirmation actually does nothing psychically other than it doesn't bring you back, but it doesn't kind of like move anything forward. Kind of like this kind of presence of trans person, like even in your like your need to be stealth at a time that you're hunted is actually part of the clinical encounter, whether you talk about it or not. And I'm thinking, I don't know if you've seen Framing Agnes, the film by Chase Joint with Joel Peterson. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. Kind of like it goes into the archives of what happened in UCLA, kind of like Stoller, Garfinkel, those clinicians who were working with trans kids, and also some of the trans adults. And they're talking about like the ways in which trans adults would lie to get what they wanted. And that was a survival strategy. And that lying is kind of like a way of being rather than trying to trick somebody, right? So here's another kind of like texture of that affect, which like it's only from a normative perspective that it would look like it is like a misrepresentation. So I would be curious about how that ripples into the treatment rather than how do you get back to either having it named or not named.
We have 5 minutes, so maybe time for one. Yeah.
I have a question about how you see your. My question is about how you see your work being in conversation with increased gender-based criminalization and criminalization in general. When I read your book, I was really struck by some of the parallels I've seen in the sex worker rights movement with the having the narrative of like the 70s being like, I love my job, I love being a whore, I'm super empowered by my work, moving to more complicated narratives, to sex workers contributing to the Me Too movement, and also again how we've seen that being weaponized in the increased criminalization of sex work as well. And so I'm just curious how you sort of, if you could talk a little bit about how you see your peers being in conversation with criminalization.
I think that thinking about sex work, which is not my domain, and thinking about sexuality and thinking about gender, like there is, I think, something happening right now. We're talking about this actually right now, yesterday when we were having our conversation. There's something right now about expanded conversations that we might not have had some time ago. Like when, you know, in my book on sexuality beyond consent, I talked about forms of desire that like I'm really expected to get slammed over that book, and it hasn't happened, which is been quite surprising to me, even though I say things that are quite dangerous there as well. So it seems that something has opened up enough to be able to hold the complexity of more conversation. I think partly because we are running up against the limitations of this kind of oversimplified discourses, like where it's something is either good or bad, right or wrong. I mean, right now, like the criminalization, like trans life started with trans children, like protecting the children, which is always the premise, right? We knew that it was never going to stop the children, but I think that like the way there is, like the first question started with the role of the state, right? What the state's role is in like this kind of experiences, and I think that there's a pushback in trying to expand beyond like what this like the state's hold over us, and the more expansion you see, the more backlash you see, and I think that criminalization is in relation to that, and that is not, it's not like it's going to stop. It's not like we're going to win and that's going to stop, but it's going to be a back and forth.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the expansion we're seeing with respect to gender, in the context of trans and queer genders is happening at the same time as an incredible retraction. Retraction doesn't go far enough with respect to reproductive freedom, right? So we're seeing all out assaults on the possibility of doing one's gender non-normatively, including cisgender non-normatively, of sort of getting to be agentic with respect to one's gender. And by agentic, again, to think about this thing agency that does involve relations with other people, does involve the social. So I would imagine that decriminalization was also part of this attempt to clamp down on what's being opened up. So that's a first thought, right? This is happening, sort of the ways in which gender is a focus is happening across so many different sort of quadrants, right? And gender, because it's never only about gender, pulls in other things. Again, pulls in race, pulls in class, pulls in religion. And one of the reasons gender can be such a pivot is because it is gender in the sense of sex also gets into issues of reproduction, including the reproduction of the family, which is connected to the reproduction of sort of the social, and sort of we can think in Marxist psychoanalytic terms as well, right? So that gender and property, and it's just a way to sort of go at it, right? So that's a first rambling thought, but then I mean, I think the other is, and maybe this has to do with thinking about trauma differently. And I think Avgi's intervention with respect to traumatophilic, I'm hearing that there's something also about these different ways of thinking about sex work that are not sort of trying to say happy, 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 but can talk about what is hard without making that the only story, complicating Me Too narratives, right? That it's sort of, the trauma discourse has, in some sense, is exhausted, and it's being put to very mischievous purposes. So what does it mean to hack that discourse and try to think about trauma differently? And I know this is something you were doing in your solo book, we're trying to do in this book as well. And so I think that's something else that's happening. It's like, we need to be able to think about injury in very different terms, right? Outside the language of victimage, because it's not helping us.
I'm also thinking of work that has been done in thinking about how the category of trauma came about in relation to war and in relation to state expansive projects and in relation to imperialist projects. And therefore, trauma is not just this psychological category that those of us who are clinically trained are encouraged to think about, but it exists within networks of power and networks of exploitation. So it's not just an interior category, but it just throws you into the social.
All right, that's our time. I'm sure we could talk. More of the books are available, and I believe there are cupcakes.
There are cupcakes. And yes, they're thematic cupcakes. They will turn you queer or trans, or queerer or transer, if you're lucky enough.
And y'all are happy to sign some copies?
Oh, we are happy to sign. We'll sign each other's books.
I'll bring the table over here for you guys.